Hello everyone, I guess hopefully you're having a wonderful day, and today we are here with a video on why everyone loses money prospecting soccer cards. This is going to be a video that I've sort of thought about for a while, but today I was able to put together some graphs and some ideologies through all these pictures that I'll show you that seem to make sense to me. Keep in mind, at the end of the day, I'm just a random guy spewing stuff on the internet, so don't take any of this as financial advice or some deep down meaningful insight that you're going to be able to follow forever. At the end of the day, things are always changing, things are always evolving. I get plenty of things wrong, just as everyone does. No one is perfect, and yeah, I think that's a good way to preface this. With that said, though, let's go ahead and get into it. So we start with the love of prospecting. People enjoy prospecting, and rightfully so. I totally understand it. It is very exciting. It is something that you can talk about with other people online, and people will get excited about because it is the new hot thing. I've added some Instagram posts here just for context, but I mean, you can go on Instagram or any form of social media where sort of the more modern collector is, and you'll see this type of stuff everywhere. It's not exclusive to whoever's showing up on screen, and this certainly isn't a slight on any of them. They're just, putting out the content that people actually kind of want. And prospecting is something that exists in every sport. Soccer is not unique in that sense. However, soccer prospecting is a much newer thing, considering soccer cards in general have only really had much love in the hobby space for the last probably 3 to 4 years primarily. It seems to be growing both within the US and also seemingly primarily outside the US, which is great, but I think that leads to some inexperienced people sort of entering the space and maybe having, not the proper perspective on things, and that's what we'll talk about today. So I would have thought by this point people would have seen the prospecting thing play out and sort of gotten over it, but with soccer always sort of adding new collectors, we still cycle through the same sort of mistakes that we've made in the past, and hopefully this video can shine some light on that. So I totally understand it. The idea of prospecting is great because essentially you have a prolonged form of gambling or investing in a player's career, however you want to see that, and so there will be ups and downs along the way that you can either buy, sell, or do whatever you please, and so it is very enjoyable, don't get me wrong, and the hobby is about having some enjoyment while you're there as well. I mean, that's primarily the focus of all of this, so if you enjoy that type of stuff, don't let me dissuade you, but maybe you can take some of this and employ it in a different strategy perchance. So I'll start with some American examples because I think it's important, because I think one, a lot of Americans draw from American sports to then get into soccer and sort of, take the lay of the land there. And I also think that, even people outside of America, they might look and see, how do American sports usually do and what's the, flow of a prospect in that space. So, for example, I'm going to throw, a few different names up on screen. The first one being one that's actually quite a bust. It was a hobby darling at one point, but that is Zion Williamson. I would say he's more of a bust in the hobby sense because of, injury and that type of stuff, not necessarily him not being talented or good enough. Ultimately, it's just sort of his body type and his build just doesn't really allow for, the best type of career for the most part. Of course, that could change. You never know. Next, we have Luka Modric, who has been a hobby darling ever since the beginning, and he has continued to be one of the best players in the NBA, this year leading the league in scoring. You also have Mahomes. He wasn't necessarily, the big name coming out in his rookie year, but pretty soon after that, it was apparent that he was practically the guy, and that has stuck ever since. And then you have someone like Joe Burrow. I could have thrown in tons of other names, but point being here that typically with American sports, who the best players are because they've gone through, a couple years of college more than likely. I know Luka doesn't fit that mold, but generally you're going to have an idea based off of the draft who the best players are, and usually there's enough of a sample size prior to the draft that the teams drafting them truly know that they have a high percentage chance of being the best players. So it is very formulaic. You almost know what type of player to look for, and thus a lot of people flock to them, and they tend to do pretty well throughout their career. Even if it might not be the heights that investors or flippers or speculators want, they'll still perform pretty adequate compared to what you'd expect. As for soccer, on the other hand, when you look at the Golden Boy, the best young player of each and every year, I've gone back to 2007 to 2023, and if you just scroll through the names real quick, essentially you'll find very few people that are actually hobby relevant in a long-staying sense. Now, towards the end, you start to see the likes of Kylian Mbappe, Erling Holland, and most recently Jude Bellingham, and those players definitely have a lot more hype than almost anyone else here on this list, or a lot more of a quote-unquote collector base, but a lot of that probably has to deal with, one, Mbappe probably going to lead the all-time record in terms of World Cup goals scored. He's already very close and seemingly has a lot of time left, so Mbappe's proven himself very well up until this point. Holland has had a good few years as well, along with winning the treble with Man City, and Jude has just recently made the move to Real Madrid and has been doing amazing things since making that move. So it makes sense why those three would have a lot of hype, a lot of excitement in the collector base now. But other than that, I mean, most of these other names are practically no ones when it comes to collecting, and seemingly at the time they would have had a decent amount of hype around them, ultimately to flame out and not really, achieve what people would have thought. Of course, there's a name like Sergio Aguero in there. People did like Balotelli back in the day. Pogba would have been huge, but then kind of fell off, of course. And that's just sort of the arc of a lot of these players' careers. As I mentioned before, I think these are the three standouts with Erling Haaland, Kylian Mbappe, and Jude, so we'll talk about them here in a second. I think they're essentially on a different level, which is good or also bad, I guess, depending on how you want to view it. They have stood up and above the rest of the soccer prospecting space, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have provided amazing financial returns on their cards, because when they were prospects, people knew that they were good. Erling Haaland, I mean, of course, at the very, very beginning, back when he's at Salzburg, a little bit of an unknown name, but quickly burst onto the scene. Mbappe's been a large name in the space as long as soccer cards have basically been a big thing, and Jude Bellingham also has been well known ever since his card started getting printed. So with Erling Haaland, I put the orange carbon refractor here, but that is not the card that the graph is showing. That's actually showing the Topps Chrome base, so keep that in mind. That's my bad. I apologize. I won't do it again. But ultimately, as you can see here, I mean, this graph begins back in 2020, and now the prices are about half of what they were at the beginning. Despite, in the meantime, Erling Haaland going to Man City, winning a treble, breaking the Premier League goal-scoring record, I mean, doing so many amazing things, and no one seems to care, because ultimately, if you were huge on Haaland at the beginning, you probably are still now, and a lot of people in between that time have gotten out for whatever reason. Keep in mind, of course, we'll see this style of graph where there's a huge spike and thus a kind of drop-off eventually. This is pretty universal for a lot of soccer, so we'll see that. But generally speaking, I think comparing to pre-boom, like if you compare to middle of 2020, which is when these prices start, to now, most things are around where they were then. I think for the most part, you can kind of chop off this huge spike in 2021, maybe a little bit of the whole year of 2021, really. But if you chop off that year, most prices are around where they were in middle of 2020 on just general soccer cards, while this Erling Haaland has dipped quite a bit. The Mbappe is, relatively the same. This chart shows it being a bit up, and, part of the reason I think here is because I'm looking at a gold refractor, which is very, very hard to get, and thus, the harder to attain cards have a better chance of staying up and increasing compared to something like a base card. Also here, keep in mind, this is May 4th of 2020 when this $16,000 sale happened for this gold refractor Kylian Mbappe. $16,000 in soccer cards in May 4th of 2020 was insane. $16,000 now is still a good bit. It's about at 21, 22, so it's up a little, but the general space of soccer card collecting has grown massively from May 4th, 2020 until now, and during that same time, Kylian Mbappe's cards have seen a rise, at least this card has, but generally speaking, they've stayed the same, despite the huge collector bump. Jude Bellingham has been a no commodity from the very beginning, and as you can see here, I mean, there was a huge price in effect at the very beginning, and eventually you start to see it sort of bottoming out in 2023 before he moves to Real Madrid and then has the big season he's had. But even then, it doesn't, bump up drastically. Some of the lows down here might have been, $60-$70, and at the highs you can get maybe 150, but ultimately there's a pretty straight line down here despite him doing amazing things and getting a big transfer. And that's how the successful prospects of the era have fared. We'll look at some of the unsuccessful ones, because for every successful one, there are plenty of unsuccessful. Someone like João Felix was a hobby darling more towards the beginning of the hobby boom. And as you can see here, his prices are down 93% over the entirety of the Silver Prism graph. And now they command, I think that's like 30, 40 bucks, essentially, despite at one time being 500 to 1,000 pretty consistently for about a year. Ansu Fati's another huge example of this, down 99.35%. For him, there really never was much of a jump. He struggled with a lot of injury issues and thus has sort of just had a precipitous fall continuously as year after year has gone on, to the point now where, as you can see, I mean, you can barely even tell what price they're at. They're so close to the bottom of the graph. And another player like Pedro has sort of followed the same suit, still holding at least something of a price, but here this is a PSA 9, initially around $100, $200, and again, with injuries and just ill performances in general, and not really being a hobby darling, you can now see that they're closer to maybe $10, $20, $30, and some sales will go up, but ultimately pretty stagnant near the bottom. And so I think the issue here, at least for me, is that I think soccer is much more akin to baseball rather than basketball, football, any of the American sports. I don't think that a player comes into the soccer space and immediately shines. And if they do, as you saw earlier, the price is baked in because people are going to know that they're shining, they're going to know that they're good, and they're going to buy in and pay hand over fist because they're excited. I think a lot of players here on the left-hand side, of course you have Lewandowski and Modric, are more players that sort of throughout their career slowly build momentum and get people to love them for one reason or another, compared to just being instantly the darling of the sport, while Otani and Mike Trout are similar examples in baseball. I also think that, Messi and Ronaldo probably have some sort of factor here in people thinking that you're going to be the best of the best from the very beginning, because Messi was very early on a known commodity, same with Ronaldo, and they continued to do that then for almost 20 years. People think that that's the norm, but it certainly isn't. For someone like Mike Trout, this is much different of a graph compared to what we were looking at with soccer, or at least the soccer prospects that we were viewing. This is a card that basically was uncared for a long time. Now, part of that was it's a base card, but also Mike Trout, I mean, there are videos of his big cards being hit early on, and people weren't even excited. They were, asking, who is this guy? Does anyone know anything about him? And ultimately, as you can see with the prices here, no one really cared. Now, of course, again, the huge spike here is going to sort of coincide with the hobby boom and all that, but take the huge spike away, cut that off, and you still see that basically it's been a slow build up throughout his entire career for the most part to the prices he is today. It wasn't some, huge up and to the right his entire career. The first 5-6 years basically had no up and to the right. It was just sitting down there at the bottom. And then you start to slowly have people building their careers and their legacies and their stats and their, well, in this case, not trophies, because Mike Trout hasn't done anything when it comes to playoffs, but baseball's a little bit of a different sport in that sense. Nonetheless, you get what I'm getting at. For example, here we're going to look at Lewandowski. I'm going to use market value over time since we don't have the analytics nor the collector base that spans that long back to where we would have been buying Lewandowski stickers way back in the day. But you get a good idea based off of the market value. Back here in, say 2007, 2008, essentially worthless. 2010, almost 5-10 mil. 2011 to 2013 gets a bit of a bump that probably would have induced some sort of, hobby excitement. And then the move to Bayern would have done a little something, but ultimately him solidifying his goal scoring tally at Bayern would have been what really does it in terms of a hobby sense. Now, at the end of a player's career, there's always going to be this sort of marching down in terms of market value within the sport because obvious reasons. So this marching down probably isn't what would have happened in terms of his card prices. It probably would have stayed stagnant or maybe even moved up a little bit, but you get the idea. This wasn't some immediate, very high price that just continued to be a high price. This was a long process, a very slow and building process within the soccer space. Again, going back to baseball here, we have an Otani comp, and as you can see again, now, this one's a little bit of a shorter time frame, but ultimately his cards weren't really worthwhile until 2021, 2022, despite being a 2018 rookie. Then suddenly, he's the name of the hobby, everyone loves him, and he's a big name and gets big prices, and that's sort of how it works. Again, another comparison going back to soccer would be Luka Modric. Looking at his price graph over time, you know, there's definitely a bump at the beginning, but to be honest, back in the day, a 20, 30 mil midfielder isn't going to demand, you know, a very, very high hobby status. As time goes on and we hit the 2010s, 2015, and go into the 2020s, as you can see, of course, again, there's a huge fall off, but that's going to happen with any player in terms of their market value. Messi and Ronaldo are like 20 mil-ish a piece at the moment, and obviously they're the best players of all time, so it's not a just way of comparing. But again, you see the peak of this player towards the middle of their career, not at the very beginning, because that's not how soccer works. And so that takes me to my final thoughts. The first one being that prospects take time in soccer. If that wasn't proven enough, I don't know, maybe I failed this entire video, but ultimately, it's going to take time. Soccer is not a sport where someone jumps onto the scene early and dominates for 20 years. I know Messi, I know Ronaldo, but you put that out of your head. That does not work that way. There's rarely ever examples of that, and if that's what you're looking for, you're going to get burnt time and time and time again. The second point would be that most people want a quick flip. A lot of people are in the prospecting game to buy today and sell in a month, or buy then and sell when. It's not this sort of long building process that people are looking for, and I think that that's what causes a lot of this mayhem and just rushing towards players that probably don't deserve the prices people are paying, is because people are excited, people are energetic for the gamble. They want to go out there and make some moves and build their bankroll, and this year they have this much money, but in 5 years if they compound it and hit the right players, they're going to have 10 times the money. But ultimately, it's not the way to go, as we've saw throughout this entire video. My main conclusion from all this is that I think buying new rookies is an almost surefire way to lose money. Again, not investing advice, all that jazz, but I don't think you would do too bad if you just took this piece of advice. I think a lot of people that have been in the collecting space for a while probably have, but I think that it's important to note that it's almost always better to just wait a year, wait 2 years, wait 3 years, and wait until almost no one cares about that player to then buy if you truly believe in them, because ultimately, very few, if any, players are going to do things within the first 1 to 2 to 3 years that are going to solidify a legacy. Again, the only people we've really seen that from would maybe be Holland and Mbappe. And Mbappe is pretty big because of the World Cup, but even Holland, like, sure, he has a treble at Man City, but if his career ended tomorrow, that is not enough to solidify some crazy legacy in the hobby. Yeah, great player, all that, but it's not enough. And then finally, it's not sexy or exciting, but from what I can tell, it works. That's the way I'd put it. I know it's not what people want to hear. I know it's not the way people want to go about it, but ultimately I think it's a much more prudent way and a much more savvy way of going about it that also gives you a long time horizon. You know, people want to talk about, oh, I want to invest in a player's career. Well, if you really want to do that, buy low and have their cards for 5 to 10 years and see how it plays out. Maybe you lose. Darn, you bought cards that were cheap that no one cared about. Now they don't care about them anyway. So what's the big deal, really, right? It's much better than buying cards that everyone cares about that then in a few years no one cares about, right? Because that's a much more devastating downside to face than the alternative. But yeah, that's going to be it for my video today. Hopefully you enjoyed. If you did, make sure to leave a like. Would love to hear your thoughts down below in terms of prospecting soccer, how it compares to other sports, any thoughts you have on the video. I'd love to hear them. If you want to see more videos like this as soon as I go live, do make sure to subscribe. And with that said, hopefully you have a wonderful day, and peace.